Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to begin with a story. The story takes place in Belgrade, Serbia. The date is the 25th of July, 1914. The ambassador of Austria-Hungary is ready to leave the premises of the embassy, but he is nevertheless expecting a visitor. The government of his country put an ultimatum valid 48 hours to the government of the country the ambassador is accredited to. It came as a result of the assassination of the crown prince and the heir of the throne of Austria-Hungary in Sarajevo on the 28th of June the same year. The ambassador, Vladimir Giesel, Freiherr von Gieslingen, aged 54, is Imperial Army general. He had fought in wars before he was committed to the diplomatic service of his country. The ultimatum expires at 6 p.m. sharp. Only some minutes before its expiration, the ambassador receives a visitor. It is the Prime Minister of Serbia who comes to hand over in person his government's response to the ultimatum. The atmosphere is tense because of the enormous importance of the response. It is a matter of life or death for the small country to provide an answer to its powerful neighbor, ranking among several most influential states in the world. Besides, the ultimatum is at the core of a huge diplomatic crisis at the European level. The Prime Minister, Nikola Pasic, is 15 years older than the ambassador. He is a civil engineer by profession and holds a degree from the Eidgenössische Technische Hochschule in Zurich. The two men speak German. The ambassador asks whether the government of Serbia accepted all the items of the ultimatum. The Prime Minister says his government accepted all of them except one. And that is enough for the ambassador to declare the diplomatic relations of the two countries interrupted as of that very moment. The conversation is over, the visitor leaves. The ambassador takes the car to go to the railway station. He leaves the hosting country at once, and 3 days later, a declaration of war will follow. That was the beginning of the disaster known under the name of World War I. But at the same time, late in the afternoon, on the 25th of July, 1914, far away from the scene we have just evoked, a French politician delivered a speech to his supporters. The scene takes place in Lyon, in France. The politician's name is Jean Jaurès. He is one of the leading personalities among the European socialists. At the moment of delivering the speech, he is unaware of the outcome of the ultimatum because the two events, the one in Belgrade and the other in Lyon, went in parallel. However, Jaurès is fully aware of the danger that overshadows the entire continent, threatening to evolve into a catastrophe. Therefore, he says, we have against us, against the peace, against the life of men, terrible forecasts at the present moment. It's useless to say he was right. But what is of interest here is the mode in which the French politician and his fellow socialist colleagues all over Europe were trying to overcome the situation and avoid catastrophe. The idea was almost brilliant, but regretfully unfeasible. Socialist politicians and trade union leaders of that time wanted to appeal to the working class to organize general strikes in all potentially belligerent countries with the aim to prevent their governments from going to war. Jaurès' personal tragedy illustrates the failure of the idea. Only 6 days after the speech given in Lyon, he was assassinated by a nationalist student. It happened in Paris, Rue Montmartre. Moreover, it was on the day of his funeral that the French socialists embraced the cause of war, siding with the government which was to fight Germany. Pacifism could not hold. Nationalism prevailed, leading directly to disaster. The scope of disaster in the World War I was beyond imagination. It included casualties of 11 million military personnel and 7 million civilians. Historians claim, however, and we have heard that we have heard that here, that the World War I was only the first act of the drama completed with the World War II, bringing even more casualties and the use of nuclear weapons at its end. The world collapsed, it was ravaged and ruined, and as an aftermath of the whole set of tragic events of the first half of the 20th century, which devastated the entire planet, remained only the words of a well-known song composed in the 1950s, "Where Have All the Flowers Gone?" Marlene Dietrich performed the German version, which became known worldwide under the title "Sag mir, wo die Blumen sind." Returning to the efforts to avoid the disaster, a question comes inevitably to one's mind. What was wrong with the design to stop nationalism and nationalists go to war in 1914? Why couldn't it work? Such questions call for research and prudence. They are not to be answered outright. One of the main troubles seems to lay in the approach to the problem. The pacifism on the eve of the World War I lacked universal character. It was tailored as an aspect of the class struggle, and that particular feature represented its feeble point. One is tempted to say that the solidarity of the working class was not sufficient to save the world. This is true even if we disregard the subsequent twisting of the idea and the improper use of the concept of the working class solidarity, which had the Bolshevik Revolution and its authoritarian regime as its main outcome. Europe, between the two world wars, became a theater of intolerance, authoritarianism, and dictatorship. Reference to tolerance, peace, and human dignity could find no echo in the time when the continent suffered dictatorships and wars. There seemed to be no hope amongst the disaster, war crimes, crimes against humanity, millions of casualties, and the total destruction, so it seemed, of the whole civilization. The total destruction was somehow announced in a Hans Baumann's poem that became a Nazi anthem. The characteristic words were in the refrain, "We shall keep on marching when everything falls into pieces." Pacifism needs sound and solid foundations. The ones it was based on in 1914 were insufficient and weak. Instead of a standpoint based on class affiliations, there should have been an approach fairly transcending social classes and acceptable to everyone. Generating hate as a lever of the class struggle and authoritarianism should be replaced, or should have been replaced, by an attitude putting forward a universal solidarity of all human beings. In this respect, the poet was right, saying, "Then we could make a round around the world if all the people in the world wanted to give their hand." It's Paul IV. The title of the poem is La Ronde. Universalism must overcome class particularism so as to provide grounds for solidarity and social action on a broader scale. It is the concept of human rights that has been laid down on an adequate approach for that. Samuel Moyne, a Harvard scholar, rightly stressed the universalism of the Enlightenment as decisive for the birth of the modern idea of human rights, which dates back to that period. So human rights were to pave the path to peace and progress of the mankind, reappearing on the horizon at the end of the World War II with the United Nations Charter. We read in its preamble that the founders of the New World Organization, aiming to maintain peace on the globe, were determined to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights. The necessity of broadening the foundations for the edifice of peace and progress led to the idea of human rights because of their universality. Their enjoyment is the entitlement of each and every human being. The human rights were laid down as the foundation of the New World Order, but they nevertheless had a long way to run in many countries of the world. Racial segregation was a huge problem in societies like the United States of America or South Africa. It is noteworthy that the two countries mentioned managed to overcome the racial problems exactly by way of affirming protection of fundamental human rights. Owing to their universality, the human rights could serve the purpose of achieving justice in approach to each and everyone. And Malcolm X was right to underline the proper roots of human rights, saying, civil rights means you're asking Uncle Sam to treat you right. Human rights are something you were born with. That's from his famous speech of April 1964. Human rights were accepted both at the level of nation states and at the international level. They represent the subject matter of numerous treaties. Government sections, as well as those of NGOs, have contributed to their dissemination, growth, and indeed omnipresence. Human rights have become a symbol of the world of our days. However, huge challenges to many societies appear throughout the globe, and it seems to be a valid question whether the responses to these challenges should be given in the manner we have been used to for more than 70 years. There have been voices suggesting that some areas of law should be less influenced by human rights. Some seem to be of opinion that nation states should diminish the scope of human rights protection. Nationalism has been growing in Europe, and it looks like the disastrous old story might return. National sovereignty has on several occasions been invoked in many countries as paramount. Moreover, according to some politicians, it should put aside the approach to social problems based on human dignity and the respect for human rights. Let us therefore raise unpleasant questions. Shall we march towards destruction of civilization once again? Do we intend indeed to break into pieces the world order we have set up in the atmosphere of tolerance and human dignity? Are we going to cede before the new waves of nationalism, extremism of all kinds, and authoritarianism knocking at our doors? Your interlocutor of today takes the liberty to suggest an activist answer to these questions in the manner of General de Gaulle. 3 times no to the 3 essential questions posed. Of course, the reference is to the General's speech broadcast on Radio London on the 18th of June 1940. The exiled general treated the issue of continuing the warfare after the French defeat on that month. His words became famous. He said, "Has the last word been pronounced? Does the hope have to disappear? Is this the final defeat?" Now, to sum up, reproducing the pattern just mentioned, we should say that the last word has not been pronounced, the hope will not disappear, and the decrease of human rights is by no means acceptable. The role of human rights today is the same as it was yesterday. They are the foundations of our world. Therefore, nothing seems to be more appropriate at the present moment than to repeat President Carter's words from his inauguration speech back in 1977. Our commitment to human rights must be absolute. The human rights still count on the endeavor of women and men ready to stand up for their defense. Human rights will surmount difficulties they are facing, and that is why we must not lose faith. Thank you.
We are not going to leave you before answering certain questions. Are there questions and comments? Yes, please.
It is abundantly clear that human rights have been usurped, have been ignored, and have been totally jeopardized all over the world, but in particular in Syria. Now, I know there is the Court of Human Rights in Europe, but I think there is a higher court of justice than the Court of Justices, and that is the Court of Conscience. The court that makes us feel that what is going on is not right. Why is the world sitting there silent, not taking those people who are guilty of transgressing human rights to human rights courts of justice?
Well, I understand your message and I share your opinion. we lack initiatives concerning the Syrian crisis. I mean, initiatives coming from the other sources, not from the governmental sources. But that particular crisis is of utmost complexity, because there are militant groups fighting each other, and it is very difficult to discern which of the groups should be supported. Probably, I have no information whatsoever, they have all committed war crimes. But you see, if you support the Kurds, then Turkey will protest. If you support the Syrian opposition, then Putin is against. If you support Assad, then the Syrian opposition, of course, is against, because they made a war against the dictatorial regime. And the crisis is extremely complex, but I agree with you in general that we should pay attention, and we should try to make some effort to approach the end of the crisis, apart from the governments, of course.
Thank you very much. We are behind time, behind schedule, but if you are prepared, one more question perhaps.
If I might, Judge Popovic, given your remarks you've just made, where does the process of reconciliation fit in? Because in my own country, in Northern Ireland, reconciliation was terribly important in ending a terrible long-running crisis. Reconciliation was very important in South Africa. But in order to effectively do that, you have to turn a blind eye to some pretty horrible things that some of the participants did.
I'm sorry to say you are right, but reconciliation is even more needed in the region where I come from, in the Balkans. We have already heard that. And the question is valid because, well, I think my personal view is, and I may be wrong, of course, that the NGOs could do much more than the governments. Because the governments and the politicians, they always address the electorate, whatever they do. And there have been splendid initiatives. Our interlocutor of today, Mr. Busek, explained that there was an initiative to put the historians of the whole region together. That was in Pécs in Hungary, and to discuss how to write the history of the region, which was an excellent idea. There was some outcome as a result of it, but it is very difficult. The reconciliation is of utmost importance, I agree with you, but the techniques of reconciliation are probably different in various parts of the world. For example, in South Africa, I very much admire their reconciliation, but it doesn't work that way in the Balkans, because there are different countries competing each other, and we need to diversify the techniques of reconciliation.
Ladies and gentlemen, Judge Dragoljub Popovic, please express our sincere gratitude. Thank you. Thank you.